anthropology of religion. Today we are going to be approaching religion through the concept of practice, which is a big one in the anthropology of religion. I was playing the Thai Theravada Buddhist monks meditating before this class as a way to get us into thinking about practice. One, as a way of approaching religion from the outside as an anthropologist, but two, as a way of thinking about the ways that people get into their own religions. So meditation and the chanting you have seen here and the kinds of bodily orientations you saw some of the monks going through, sitting straight, moving slowly, giving oblations to Buddha, are specific to this religion, to this religious practice. And they've also been taken up, as I'm sure you know, in all kinds of other sort of spiritual practices. A lot of people today practice meditation, not necessarily as a Buddhist religious exercise, although we may do that, but as a way of shaping the mind or the experience or everyday perception, right? So meditation is a very clear and readily accessible example of what we're going to be talking about today, which is practical modes of getting into religion, but also thinking about religion as modes of bodily practice. Yeah? So, did everyone get a chance to look at the slides? Cool, great. We're going to go through them in some detail today. Please, as usual, raise your hand, shout out your questions and answers. I'll try and sub in with some examples from my own fieldwork. And then in the second hour, like last time, we'll do some more reading challenges and exercises. Good? Anyone have anything now that they're like, I saw this in the podcast and I really want to talk about it? If you do, let's not wait for it. Let's get to it right now. Great. Okay, cool. So, first of all, practice is a kind of very basic definition or orientation. An action or performance, something that is repeated, socially constructed, socially coordinated, and usually supported action. Especially when we're talking about the anthropology of religion, when we're thinking about practice, we're usually thinking about things that other people in your religious community would say, yeah, that's religious practice, or yeah, we support that. Not always, but sometimes, usually. Questions here? Pretty basic way. The main thing is when we're talking about practice, we're talking about the things that people do. So practices in religion, basically two ways that we can use it or focus on it in the anthropology of religion. One is that people can engage in practices without necessarily applying any meaning to them in the moment. So you can think of the kind of ritualization of going to church or temple or mosque. But also practices, we can also think about practices as things that are supposed to create in a person a particular kind of religious orientation that a person might choose to do in the moment as a way to get that kind of mood and emotion or particular orientation. Right, so we think about meditation, for example. That's a choice you make to practice something that should put your mind in a particular religious or spiritual state. Similarly, the prayers that Thai Lerman's people do, that's people choosing to cultivate a particular kind of mental state, right? So it's a practice that's supposed to evoke a religious experience. At the same time, there's lots of practices that people do in religion that might have a reason behind them and might sometimes create really powerful emotional experiences, but might equally kind of just be happening. People might just make the sign of the cross. People might just touch the feet of their guru, etc. So both kinds of practices we find in pretty much all religions, and we can look at both sides of it. And frequently, as were discussing last week, people can kind of move in and out of both kinds of practices. So at sometimes something a prayer that you might be doing might feel incredibly meaningful, and at another time it might be kind of something you just do as a matter of routine, not paying any attention to it. Yeah? Questions on this? improving. Okay. So practice, in anthropology more generally, but specifically in the anthropology of religion, comes down to this guy, Pierre Bourdieu. Have you guys met him in some of your other classes? Yeah? Oh, yeah? Kathy, you want to request something you remember about him? Just start us off. Okay, that's okay. Anyone else remember him? Think about him? From any class? Okay, but we know he's out there. We know he's in the background and stuff. So Bourdieu has this theory of practice in which practices are intrinsic to particular, as he calls fields, kind of organizations, situations, domains, basically. And practices are also involved in creating the kind of people that we are. So we do kinds of things to participate in a particular kind of field. But in doing those kinds of things, we also create ourselves as belonging to that particular kind of field. So 3 key terms in Bourdieu's practice theory. Sorry, before I go on, questions on that basic kind of overview on this slide here? No? So three major terms. The first is fields. Okay, and fields are configurations of relations between semi-autonomous actors, individuals, institutions, interest groups, who are concerned with the workings and the goods of that field. So a field is basically everyone who's kind of in a particular domain. Yeah. So if we think of if we're applying this to religion, because Bourdieu himself wasn't super interested in religion, and he may have even been against it at times. But if we apply it to religion, then we might think of, for example, a church, or like if you think about Christianity, for example, we might think of the, if we're thinking about the vineyard, we might think of all of the members, we might think about the prayer groups, we might think of the churches that splinter off from each other. I think the example Sonia has here is a university. The educational field comprises of relations between schools, lecturers and students and students, universities, parents, governments, unions, private tutors, right? So all of these different things that may or may not encounter each other every day, but are still kind of belonging to the same world. Yeah? And this is important for Bourdieu. The field thing is important for Bourdieu and for us when we're thinking about practice theory, because it determines the kinds of, again, it determines the kinds of practices that will be available to you and that you will want to do, right? So if you're participating in the Buddhist field, for example, you're not going to be expected to make the sign of the cross, to kneel on your prayer, you will be expected to kneel on your prayer, but not to kneel on a Muslim prayer mat, for example, not to face the direction of Mecca and Medina. So this field thing kind of is the background social context for every practice that you're doing. Questions on this? Does this make sense? Yes, no? Some blank looks? You kind of have a confused face. No? Okay. Good. All right. Next one. So the next key term in Bourdieu's practice theory is this idea of capital, which is the acquisition of the goods, like resources, wealth, but it could also be things like values, credentials, status, etc., which are these things that are valued within the field. Acquisition of the capital involves competition, so people have to kind of jostle. Not everyone gets capital equally. Those who possess more of the capital are recognized within the field to have more power in the field. So capital, actually before we move on, so within a field, like for example the Catholic Church, which we'll stay in for a minute, within the Catholic Church, the kind of capital that you can have might be spiritual, right? You can, sort of, for lack of a better word, collect all the sacraments. And those, but it might also be other kinds of things, like knowledge of scripture, frequently going to church, relationships with people in high positions. It might be kind of status positions, such as priest, bishop, archbishop, pope, cardinal, etc., cardinal, pope. And if you have this kind of capital, then you hold more power in the Catholic Church, in the Catholic field, right? According to Bourdieu. Now, crucially, capital acquired in one field, such as in the Catholic field, right, can be used or can be applicable in other domains. So, capital that you might acquire, a capital that might be valid in the Catholic Church, it's not only powerful religiously, but it's also powerful in other fields, such as the educational field, so schools, universities, etc. Health field, right? The Catholic Church sponsors hospitals and clinics. Catholic Church also runs development projects, so there's also industrial power that it's holding in various parts of the world. The Catholic Church is one of the greatest, the wealthiest institutions in the whole world, so it holds a kind of financial power in the financial field. Right, so capital accumulated in one field can be used in another. Not across the board, but there can be overlap, which means that the fields are not sort of fixed, bounded domains, but are rather general kind of context. Yeah? Questions, comments, issues? Lovely. And the third one, and perhaps the most important for the way that the anthropology of religion develops the theory of practice, is this one, habitus, which is incorporated dispositions that inform actions within different fields. Bourdieu called the habitus structuring structures that structure. So they're basically the way that you live out your field with your body. Okay? The way that you are disposed to perceive the world, the way that you are likely to take certain actions rather than others. And as you might be thinking, these are obviously structured by broader social things. So if you're Catholic, or if you spend a lot of time with Catholics, as I am and have, you might be disposed to cross yourself sometimes, or to bow your head and speak quietly within a sacred space. And you might not be as disposed to perform other kinds of bodily actions. At the same time, you can, oh wait, no, we're not there yet, sorry. So there's two important components to habitus, and one is your location in the field. That is your positionality, kind of the amount of capital you have, the position from which you view the world and experience the world. And disposition, which is the propensity to perceive the world and one's relation to it and act accordingly. So even if you have certain bodily habits, if you are in a particular kind of position within the field, then you still won't perform certain actions. So for example, the Catholic nuns with whom I work, they participate in the Indonesian Catholic field with priests, right? Of course. And both are kind of similarly habituated, similarly disposed to things like blessing themselves if something kind of happens, to paying attention to people who are in trouble and trying to help them out. But nuns cannot give the sacraments. They cannot baptize people, they cannot marry people, etc. And so their position prevents them from having the same kind of habitus as other people in their field. Right? So habitus is about the kind of structures that will lead your body, or encourage your body to perform different actions, but also about your structural position in that world. Make sense? Questions on this? Great. So, in not so short, actually, Within fields, individuals are positioned in semi-autonomous configurations in relation to other actors. Semi-autonomous here means that you're never fully in control of your actions because they're structured by society and by other people. But equally, you're never in control of anyone else's actions, and your actions are never fully determined either. Okay? That's what semi-autonomous means here. So within fields, individuals are positioned in semi-autonomous configurations in relation to other actors. Individuals acquire, this is acquire the capital, right? Individuals acquire through various, not fully conscious means, the knowledge of who they are and how to act. Habitus is the set of dispositions that shapes both individual subjectivities and people's actions. So habitus patterns actions and practice, ways of doing things. Practice reproduces both individual habitus and whole structure. So the example here, a devout Hindu might touch his teacher's feet in greeting. And when he's doing this, it might be kind of routine. It might feel natural. It might feel like an instinct, right? You just go down and just do it. But in so doing that, he reproduces the guru as his spiritual superior and reproduces the idea of a spiritual superior and inferior at the same time. So the action is structured by the field, by the broad array of actions available to devout Hindus. It's structured by this person's experience, but it's also reproducing that field and the actions inherent to it. Questions, comments here? Those of you who were in theory last semester might start to see how this kind of seems a little bit like performativity, yeah? And that's because Judith Butler was drawing directly on Bourdieu when they were creating that theory, thinking that out. Routinization. So practice is patterned. You do it and you do it again and you do it again and you do it again and you do it again. And so it can become unthinking and, as I said, instinctual or natural. It can feel like it's just something that you're going to do. We have the example here that you wouldn't just come into the room and give me a hug or give Tom a hug. That might seem a little weird because it's not a thing that you have done before, right? Something kind of exceptional would have to happen. At the same time, it's not an action that's unavailable to you. You could theoretically do that, and in doing that, you would kind of nudge the social situation one way or another. You have to find out. So the point is that practice can become routinized. So you stop doing things because you are consciously thinking, I'm going to do this, and instead you just kind of do it. And this happens because of repeating those practices over and over and over again, right? So the example Soumya has here is after years and years of teaching, she's noticed that students often tend to sit in the same seats week after week. I was thinking about this morning. I think you guys mixed it up a little bit more. So well done, you've nudged the social structure on. But it is kind of a thing that happens. It doesn't necessarily have any meaning to it, right? Maybe it does for some of you. You might think this seat right in the middle. I'm going to talk to my invisible student now. This really centers me. I feel like I'm in the midst of everything, and I choose to. But for many of you, it's going to be this is near the edge, so that I don't have to do too much movement, or this is just where I happen to be, right? So it doesn't have too much meaning, if any at all. And then once you're there once, you kind of repeat it. For no real reason, you just do. And then it becomes normal, so that it almost feels like you have to. And it might feel weird to kind of sit in a different seat. If someone else sits in your seat, you might think, oh, why are you there? At the same time, this goes back to that very first slide, right? So we can think about action as something that becomes routinized, something that becomes divorced from meaning. But equally, you can choose to continue practicing the same thing as a way to deepen the experience. So prayer, for example, when Tanya Lerman's interlocutors are imagining God comforting them in moments of distress, and they're doing that every day for weeks, months, years on end. This is an intentional practice that they're trying to do to cultivate meaning, or to cultivate a particular experience in their lives. Questions on this? Great. So practice, even though it might be repeated, and even though it might be structuring you, it does contain the seeds of change and innovation. And that's because of this semi-autonomous thing. And it's also because, well, it's because of a lot of things, but it's partially because there are lots of actions available to you at any moment that would be equally supported within the field. Right? Some moments, especially in religion, are a bit more constrained than others. But by and large, you have a huge number of actions available to you, and you can choose to do one that's slightly different from maybe what you've done before, as a way to encourage a social situation to go in a different direction. So here's Summer's example, which I think might be tied to some direct experience. That if you notice that, or if you feel like as a female that you keep getting asked to go get coffee, you might just remove yourself from the situation so that that doesn't happen. But if people need coffee and you're just not there, you've removed yourself from the situation. They'll ask someone else to get coffee, and then they might ask that person again the next week if you continue to remove the situation. And eventually, the person who's assigned to get coffee might be the young one, or the person nearest the door, or whatever it is, right? It shifts. It shifts. So your slight actions can change the scope of the field. And this can happen in religion too. And I think it's most apparent when we look at religious practices sort of historically. The ways that the kind of body is expected to behave in medieval Christianity is quite different from how it's expected to behave in the Vineyard in Chicago and California. And you can also, so you can make these like little adjustments, right? To kind of shift things in your direction or in a different direction, or to experiment or to play with what's available to you. But you can also make really big changes. So your body and your habitus, the things that seem kind of natural to you, if we are going to be on, if we're going to buy into Bourdieu, if we're going to believe that, okay, yeah, I've practiced these kinds of things over and over the course of my life, that's why they feel natural, then it also makes sense that if we change everything we do, all of the actions, all at once, then we're also really going to change who we are as people, and perhaps as religious subjects. So this might be what happens when people convert from one religion to another. If you're converting from Christianity to Islam, for example, and you're a woman, you might start to wear the veil. You might start to pray 5 times a day. You're going to attend the mosque instead of the prayer room, instead of the church. And the Bible study. You are going to have a different diet, different fasting days. Everything, your communities are going to change too, right? The people you see every day or every week, the kinds of conversations you have with family and friends, maybe even the classes you're interested in school. Everything is really going to change by virtue of this, by an intentional conversion. And that can be really, really, really difficult, no matter which conversion you're doing. But it is something that people do every day. That people are always converting religions. And often part of the conversion process, very, very consciously, is one of changing the practices in order to gain these dispositions, in order to gain the kind of belief and the kind of faith that people want in the religion. Questions, comments? Great. So, if we're going to take practice theory and use it in religion, we can, first of all, do this kind of straightforwardly. It's pretty clear what we can do. So we can study what people are doing. And we can think about how what they're doing is associated with the field, the communities, the domain in which they're a part of. And we can kind of cut that field in different ways. So we can have a sort of the field of religion. We can have a field of Buddhism, etc. We can have a field of Manchester, right? We can think about practice in the relationships between different people, the kinds of capital that is sought, acquired, the kinds of competitions that are had to acquire that capital. And we can think about how different actors set about accumulating, oh, I just said that, sorry. And we can think about what constitutes religiosity within this field, right? What kind of actions, what kind of practice is registering as religious, and what is registering as like just, everyday, not religious. This would be a kind of straightforward, to the letter application of Bourdieu. Yeah? Questions, issues, comments on that? Great. So if I were to take straight up Bourdieu's theory and apply it to the Catholic nuns that I work with, I might look at which I think I've done earlier this lecture, is I might look at the nuns in relationship to the other people in the local Catholic Church field. So the priests, the altar servers, the parishioners of the church, and the donors who donate money so that they can do their projects, the people who come to their clinics and their schools, the kids who live in their dorms, etc. And I might think about how the different sort of power dynamics between those different people and how that manifests in practice. So I might look at how the nuns kind of, when they greet a priest, they touch their foreheads to the back of his palm. When they greet school children, they expect the school children to touch their foreheads, to kiss their hand, right? I might also look at what constitutes capital amongst them. So years in the order constitutes capital. The longer you've been a nun, the more power you have. The younger a nun you are, the more likely you're going to be expected to clean the pig stall. Yeah? There are also certain kinds of sort of extra capital you can get as a nun. You can get sent to study in Rome as opposed to getting sent to study in the provincial capital of Indonesia. That gives you a little bit more authority and power within the order. You can have spent a lot of time working with people in places that are considered extremely remote and difficult. That'll give you a certain kind of authority and power to speak on like what the order should do. And you can also have kind of more mystical abilities that might manifest as the ability to see spirits or the deceased or something like that. And this gives you a special kind of power within the order as well. And these are various kinds, and the nuns are kind of constantly trying to hold on to some of them and to prove their worthiness using some of these. But at the same time, because humility and virtue are particular kinds of capital for nuns, they also try to kind of undermine the capital that they might have, right? And finally, I might start to think about which kinds of women, which kinds of nuns are trying to get which kinds of capital. And when something doesn't work out, when you get, instead of getting sent to Rome, you get sent to Bali, how does that, what's your next move? How do you talk to your friend who comes back from Rome speaking fluent Italian? Right, so that's what I might do if I was using this with my own work. Questions, comments? Okay. okay, but at the same time, we can kind of go the other direction and try to get into people's skin, so to speak, so into people's bodily habitus themselves. So we can explore individuals' practical understanding of the relationships within which they are enmeshed. And we can ask questions about religious subjectivity and the role of practice. So like how doing things makes you feel. And this is kind of more the tack that Lerman is taking, right? Because she's trying to figure out how these prayer practices of these evangelical Christians are transforming their religious experience. So she's not kind of taking this, I mean, obviously she's not taking a straight up Bourdieu approach. She's not really delimiting the domain, the field. She's not talking too much about capital or power. She's talking about practice and the way it gets embedded in the body as particular kinds of experiences. Yeah.
There is a bit where she talks about capital, about like the prayer warriors.
Yes,
where,
yeah.
Like, people who are able to more vividly experience God or whatever are more likely to achieve like higher positions within the church.
Yes, excellent, great. So this is an excellent reading of Lerman. Even though it's not her main focus, she is bringing up this capital thing and showing how the certain kinds of practices, the prayer warriors, are allowing some people to reach different kinds of power. Yeah,
There was a bit of an inconsistency when she was also like, oh, you can reach, high positions in other ways, but like, and saying, oh, they're equal, but they're not really.
Yeah. Yes, yeah. So, for instance, it's saying Lerman argues, okay, there's other ways to achieve sort of power or capital. And that might be a better way to say it, because there's certainly other ways to achieve capital, but the power is.
Yeah. So when she was talking to some congregants, they were like, oh yeah, there are other ways to achieve through like volunteering or like doing all this stuff in the church. And they say, oh, it's equal, but like really when you look at like the positions people achieve, it's not really.
Right. Yeah, sure. It's not exactly equal. This is something I hear all the time with the nuns, that they're kind of like, oh, we have a special power because we're able to kind of talk directly to the people, and the priests are not. And they're like, well, it's not a matter of who has more power or not. It's just a matter of position. It's all. I'm like, it's not though, because the priests are making the calls. Yeah, absolutely. So taking this kind of approach doesn't necessarily preclude our ability to say who has more capital or how are people achieving capital. We can still do both. Other comments, questions? Cool. The key thing about this approach that's often been used in anthropology of religion is that by looking at, this is the kind of habitus side of things, so by looking at habitus, we get to learn a sense of how religious practice gives people a sense of who they are as people, as members of a religious community. Now, while the religious field may be kind of the main field in which certain kinds of habits are developed, those can spill out into other domains. And so focusing on practice allows us to see the crossover between different kinds of fields. This is what the Bender article, which is one of the two articles that that Somia's podcast is based on. This is the kind of main point that she makes. And there's 3 examples there, so I guess I'll give those first and then we can talk about them. So Courtney Bender, here's the article, or the chapter, Practicing Religions. And she argues that practice in one field can encompass the individual's engagement in other fields. And that's because practices can be creative and innovative as much as routinized. So when you kind of learn to practice, to move your body and move through the world in a particular way, even in a religious space, if that's your kind of main space for your sense of self, when you move into other spaces, you might carry over a little bit of that. And the same would apply for other kinds of fields. If the education field is your main domain, you may accidentally find yourself lecturing your brothers and sisters, as I am sometimes told to have done. Practices become powerful and resilient by being embedded in everyday life and reproduced over centuries, right? Not exactly the same, because there's always nudges, there's always little creations, there's always little innovations, but we learn how to act in a particular religion from our elders, often from our parents, but not always, who learned it from their elders, who learned it from theirs, etc. So things, habits, actions get kind of passed through. But they're always open to reinterpretation, and it's not just that they're open to reinterpretation, they're forced into reinterpretation by taking our bodily habitus into new spaces that we haven't been before, and we have to still be in existence. So some examples. No, not yet. Right, so she takes Bourdieu's reflection on practice to those areas that he did not explore, like the reproduction of religious difference in an otherwise secular environment, or the ways of managing and experiencing one's religious identity in everyday life. So again, Bourdieu wasn't super interested in religion, and when he was much more interested in the power and capital bit, and less so in the habitus bit. But for some reason, anthropologists who focus on religion have kind of latched on to the habitus bit a bit more. So Bender advocates shifting the research focus from objects and practices that appear to be religious, that are obviously religious, the chanting in the temple, and instead looking at the processes that make things seem religious. How does something become a religious action and other things not? So that means looking beyond practices which are evidently categorized as religious, like rituals and prayers, and towards interconnected practices of everyday life that are holdovers from the field, the habitus, and that which produce and reproduce what constitutes religion in relation to broader social life. So she wants to move beyond the sort of church sphere, the religious sphere, into the other spheres to see how that religious habitus is structuring other parts of social life, and vice versa. Which parts of social life are then restructuring religious action, religious practice. Questions, thoughts, comments? Lovely. So Bender gives 3 cases, which are all US based and all kind of incidental, by which I mean things that happen while she's traveling. So the first one is 2 white strangers, a woman and a man, and they're just chatting about a diet. And the woman says that she doesn't eat pork as she's married to a Muslim. And then they begin talking about Islam. And then they start talking about the bandana she's wearing as hijab, as a compromise, because her husband wants her to veil her hair, but she doesn't want to be wearing a headscarf. So she wears the bandana. And then they start to talk about gender relations, and then they talk about Islam and Muslims in America. So it doesn't start off as a religious conversation. And in fact, it isn't really a religious conversation because it happens really fast on a bus between strangers. And it goes through all of these different things. But Bender is able to say that this very brief conversation happening in a secular sphere indicates what it means to be religious, to talk about religion, and to recognize religion. So it's in this space that wouldn't necessarily be called religious or religion that the religious starts to appear. Through all of these different practices, right? Through the dietary practice, the dressing practice, the gender relations practice, etc. Her second example comes from a crowded New York subway train, where this homeless woman who's kind of disheveled, stumbling, and not smelling very good, and everyone's kind of leaning back from her a little bit until she comes upon 2 nuns. Always warms my heart when I say nuns mentioned in anthropology. Anyway, they bless her, and the whole mood of the whole carriage changes. Yeah? Not just between the nuns and the homeless woman, but everyone else who's around. So suddenly the space kind of becomes religious. People start crossing themselves, they start smiling. Something has changed. And that's because of this practice that these nuns have carried over from their own religious field into this other zone where Catholicism does not really, reign at all. They carried these practices over, and in using them in this new space, they changed the space itself and everyone's relations in the moment. Yeah? So this is an example of the habitus of the religious space carrying over into a secular space and restructuring the relationships. I think you could think about this particular one the other way too. If you think about going to visit some of the kind of ancient churches or temples that people have practiced in religiously for centuries, going to visit them as a tourist, having to pay a ticket, taking photographs, hearing all of the noise, the habitus of the kind of secular world, the actions you take touring around a city, moved into the religious space, transform it into a kind of tourist space, or into an aesthetic space, an art space, right? So the habit of your body transferred into another location, restructures, subtly nudges it. And the final example comes from a financial consultant she encounters on an airplane. And he tells her that he became a Southern Baptist minister after he was kind of flitting between various Christian denominations, finally found a spiritual home in the Baptist church. And he claims he has a personal relationship with God, prays, meditates, gets instructions from God. And they're not just religious matters, but also business practices, what he should do in his church, how much money he should invest here, who he should hire or fire, but also just, his own kind of business ventures personally, right? So he's hearing instructions from God, which he is able to hear because of prayer practices like the kind we're reading about and when God talks back. But it's informing the financial realm. So where, Bender asks, would we draw the line between religious life and economic life in this case, for example? And I'm sure we can think of loads of other cases as well. Comments, thoughts, questions? Lovely. So Bender takes as her kind of starting point to discuss these three cases a long-standing debate in the study of religion more broadly. So there was this kind of theory, the secularization theory that came about with the industrial era and modernization, which was that the more modern we became, the more that rationalization and industry was introduced into people's lives, the less we would see religion mattering. People would become less religious, right? People would become disenchanted, as Weber might say. But actually, that's not what happened. In some ways, some people have said people have become more religious, or at least religion has remained the same. But what has happened is it's taken different forms because of the different things that modernity has introduced into our lives. So now it's impossible, Charles Taylor says, to have something called naive belief, where you just believe, yes you do, and you never have to face any questions or problems or debates or challenges. Now, says Taylor, and Bender agrees, now people who are religious actively have to choose it in the face of lots of things telling them otherwise. So she argues that religious people have to work hard at being religious, right? It's a choice to which they commit, and it informs their being in the world, and not just when they're practicing religion. And the cases that she chooses make that kind of obvious. And that might be because 70% of the United States professes to be holding a certain... Yeah?
I think it's about when on the census in the UK, it's about the same percentage of people, I think it's 60-something% of people identify as Christian. So I think censuses are like a good way of getting a graph of how like religious people are. Because I think people, because we're like Christian societies, people identify as Christian even though they don't engage in any Christian practices at all. It's just like a cultural thing.
Yeah, great point. So we might might not want to take this little snippet too seriously, this 7%, because it might be the same in the UK, but the examples in the US might be particularly potent for different reasons too. When I was reading this, I was also thinking, well, in Indonesia, technically 100% of the population professes a religion, because you're legally required to by law. So these, but the kind of habitus that, and the power it has in different domains changes, because people are expected to have a religion, they're also expected to use their own religion's habitus. So it wouldn't really be the case if a nun was in a Hindu or a Muslim area and encountered a homeless man, the atmosphere wouldn't become more religious, because she probably would have much less of an effect there than it would on a subway train. So these kind of religious habits, even if there are people who are not practicing or who don't hold a religion, they might still be able to recognize certain religions because of the kind of history of the religion being embedded in society, in infrastructures, in laws, and in people's bodily habits over the centuries, even in secular spaces. So religion, she argues, becomes a self-conscious practice not confined to the religious domain, but just spilling out kind of everywhere, because religious people themselves are also, spilling out everywhere, having all kinds of lives. And we'll come back to this in the mediation lecture next week. Other thoughts on this? Great. So finally, a practice approach to religion focuses on what people do. It asks how people understand their position and the relations of which they are part, and how they act according to that. So that understanding might be fully incorporated in the body, so people might not be used to articulating it in words, and yet if we take a practice approach, we might be able to slowly untangle it by looking at the kinds of actions that people take in religious spaces and how those carry over into non-religious. We might be able to understand how people do things and what their understandings are of why they do them, without necessarily expecting that kind of reflexive knowledge. So we can ask people, like, what does it mean when you, what does it mean when you roll the betel nut all over your niece's grave, right? And they might say, oh no, it's just what the shaman, not shaman, what would you call it? The dukun told us to do, the spiritual leader, I guess. But they might also be able to say, oh, this is to seal her spirit back in, or something like that. So we can ask what these kind of practices mean without necessarily expecting people to know an answer, although they might have an answer. And this is because a practice-focused approach to religion is able to encompass both the things, everything that people do, both the things that they're able to say, this is why we do this, right? This is why we genuflect with the left knee and not the right, and the things that they don't know. This is why the priest wears this long piece of sash under his other cloak thing, right? And it can work through the movement from one kind of activity into another. So we can follow how practices move from one space to another. And finally, because practice theory focuses on actual situated practices happening that we can see, hear, experience, and participate in, it also allows us to move between objective and subjective positions ourselves as researchers. So that will allow us to think, we can move between these different scales, right? Believing selves, institutions, communities, wider structures within which they are located. So Lerman's able, even though she's not taking explicitly a practice approach, she is able, as Francis was telling us, to move from a kind of in the person experiencing God to these kinds of the capital that people acquire and the people who are able to become preachers, ministers, holders of their own church. we're able to encompass both of those because we can look at all different kinds of practice. Yeah? Thoughts, questions, comments? Okay, cool. So finally, ending with this quote from the second article, the concept of practice refers to human activity which simultaneously constructs both individuals as social beings and the social world that surrounds them. It's a good little summary, basically, of Bourdieu. And if you read the whole chapter that's there, which, again, you do not have to do, but if you're interested, Kupari goes really in depth into Bourdieu and how she particularly is using it to understand Orthodox Christians in Finland. But this is a great little kind of definition to sort of latch onto. Thinking about how human action shapes the person and is shaped by larger society. Questions, comments? Things we want to talk about? Yeah?
I was doing some reading for this part last time and came across the term like post-secular turn. I don't know what that is.
Yes, great. Thank you for the question. Isaac. Yes, awesome. So Isaac said last semester in Ethnographer's Craft, came across a definition for, or the mention of the term post-secular turn, right? And Isaac's question is, what is that? Yeah? So, anyone have any idea what that is? Before we No, we're all also agreeing, wondering? Yeah, so this is related to the secularization thesis, which was the theory that with the advent of modernity, we would see the passing of religion. So the post-secular turn is kind of doing two things. One, it's grappling with the fact that that didn't happen and saying, okay, new paradigm for religion. And at the same time, it's also approaching secular experience as a kind of religion, so to speak. Not as a religion, I would say, but as a kind of thing that we can approach through the same way we approach different religions. Because there are kinds of, we might call them spiritual or moral communities, right, following Durkheim, that look a lot like religion while still being very secular. And it can be very useful to approach even things that are explicitly secular as if they were religions. So that's kind of what that is about.
Thank you.
No problem. It's a good thing, it's a good term to sort of know or at least be aware of, because anthropologists who are writing about religion today are existing in that post this old paradigm world. And for a while, a lot of people were starting all of their articles and all of their books with this kind of premise that I just gave you. For a long time, we thought religion would disappear, but it didn't. Now what, kind of thing. People have stopped doing that because, we've kind of moved on, but that was a moment critically, definitely. Other things, comments, questions? Okay, great. Then let's take like a 5-minute break. Last time, I'd like to think about, wait, this is supposed to say compare. Hold on. Comparing what belief and practice are and what they do for the anthropology of religion. You might come at this from the kind of pros and cons angle. What would sort of tackling belief help us do that tackling practice wouldn't do, and vice versa? Or you might just start to think about like what is the difference between these anthropologically. So, anyone have any ideas? Want to add anything for us? Are we in somewhere? One difference between belief and practice in the anthropology of religion? Yeah?
Just to clarify, you're not asking what are the pros and cons of belief and practice. You're asking what's the difference between belief and practice within belief.
Correct. And I'm also asking what are the pros and cons as an anthropologist to be focusing on one or the other? I'm not asking what are the pros and cons for a religious person to be believing or practicing. That's not what I'm asking. I'm asking as an anthropologist, what might be the pros and cons of focusing on either of these?
So the answer that you're looking for to add on to this list is what are the differences between.
Yeah, exactly. So do you have it to start us out?
Well, practice compared to belief, practice is something that's like acted out in a circle form, you could say.
Acted out in what?
Circle.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas belief may not exist in a circle form.
Mm-hmm.
Another one would be that practice, like we were talking about throughout class today, may not be actually that would probably be similar to
Okay, great. Thank you.
Belief has to be conscious, but practice would be unconscious.
Okay. Whoa, 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 whoa. Okay, gosh. Good? Thank you. Yeah. What else? Yeah?
You may not be able to study practice without like knowing the specific like intentions from the person doing it, because you know what you're saying, like it might be really meaningful sometimes and other times not. So like just by looking at the practice on its own, you might not be able to know much about it.
Okay. Can you contrast that with belief? Or no?
I mean, yeah. I guess like you can only really understand belief from how somebody explains their own belief. So
Good. I'm going to say often articulated in words. Excellent, thank you. Did you have one, Isaac?
Oh, yeah, I mean, kind of similarly to that, like, focusing on practice allows you to look at people who don't have, like, core agreed on set beliefs.
Yes.
And also, I guess, like, variation within religious beliefs as well.
Yes, yeah. How do I want to summarize that? How did you summarize that in a few words? That was really good.
I guess kind of just in the negative, different communities that don't have core set beliefs.
Great. And then something about what? Something about diversity within.
Yeah, the variation within the community. You can look at the, I mean, not necessarily unified, but unified practices.
Okay. Great. I think probably both belief and practice can be variable or unifying, right? However, if we accept that taking a belief approach is particularly useful when a religion has beliefs or a creed or something of the kind, then that kind of stands as a unifying thing already, then we might be inclined to look at the variation. When do people stop believing this or that, or when are beliefs kind of different? And equally, if we're anthropologists and we're encountering this huge mess of different practices and actions, and everyone is saying all of this is Buddhist, then we might be inclined to say, okay, what are the actions that unify? Yeah, so this might be one of those examples of making a mess out of something organized and organizing a big mess. Yeah, other things you want to think about? No? Cool. Okay, now I'd like you to do what you did last time. I'm going to make all of you choose. I want you to go to this wall if you want to take a practice-based approach to the anthropological study of religion. And I want you to go to that wall if you want to focus more on belief in the anthropology of religion. Take a side. And again, we're going to try to convince Tom. Sorry, I'm putting you on the spot, Tom. You're going to have to be swayed one way or the other. Belief, practice. Practice side. This is practice? Yeah, practice side. Why? Sorry. Now, just like last week, I'm going to have you try to convince the GTI Tom to join your side. Why should we take an approach to the anthropology of religion that looks at practice? Why should we take an approach to the anthropology of religion that looks at belief? Practice people. Give us some ideas. Convince us.
Immersive study.
Sorry?
An immersive study rather than theoretic.
Talk to Tom.
It's a practice-based study, then you're immersed with the subjects you're studying versus belief only. I believe that can be more theoretic. And I think that if you are gradually becoming more of an insider than an outsider, you will have all the things.
Good. Other reasons? My practice. Yeah?
I'm not sure if this is right, but the way that anthropologist was able to believe herself in some ways through the practice because she saw the visions and things. Like when she was working with the magic before, she was practicing it every day, and then she also could believe in her own way, which is kind of vision.
Okay, great. So again, the kind of the practice of the method. Yeah, good. Other reasons? Yeah.
Okay, my reason is just practice is observable. It is bring an actual impact to reality. That is creating a relationship in the community that is real, maybe in 100%, and belief. It can also be real in mind's consciousness, but it's then having to complete this process that's creating an actual, creating something real in the world.
Okay.
Just in the mind. That's my reason.
Okay, cool. Real stuff. Anything else on the practice side? All right, rejoinder, belief.
In religion, practice doesn't mean anything without belief, because you can unconsciously do practice. You could be doing it in a non-religious way or just out of habit. So without a belief, a prior belief to inform that practice, it doesn't necessarily mean anything.
Good, great. Others?
I would just add, building on that I think belief is kind of the more core aspect of religiosity in general. Practice is super important, and I think it would be a terrible idea to approach the study of religion without looking at both of these things. But I think the practice was out of belief, right? And to
belief as this core thing and to pay attention to the reality, perhaps, of the psychology, right? And the back or in the front, ideas? My belief for you guys. Yeah?
I would say, even though I think practices may be easier to observe and easier to study, I'd say I personally find belief and how people develop belief and maintain belief are more interesting. And I think because it's more abstract, it needs more brains behind.
Now we have the original attack, let's go. Yeah. Excellent. Okay, so it's an interesting feature of that might be specific to religion that we might be interested in, ethnographic thing. Great. More comments? No? Yeah?
I think my place should be here because I believe the anthropology of religion shouldn't be about belief, not practice. It should
Okay.
be about power.
Be about power. Okay.
Yes, but belief now it has like more belief than practice. As my mate said, you can't practice without a belief, without belief. On the other hand, some people practice blindly
Yeah.
because their parents do so,
Yeah.
or because they think their religion orders them to do so. So practice is not very important. Practice always changeable according to the
Right.
environment or situations.
Cool. Okay. Practice changeable, belief not.
Yeah.
Great. Okay. Kiara, would you like to state your case?
Well, people already said this, but I just feel like you can't really look at either of those without looking at the other one, because like there'll be a set of beliefs and then there'll be practices which are based around those beliefs, and then you'll be practicing those practices, and then that will kind of ingrain the belief further, or like kind of transform it in a certain way to like in the way which you practice it can transform the belief, and then it's like a whole kind of never-ending cycle of just like belief and then practice and then belief and practice and stuff like that. And like what you said about immersive research or whatever, because like I like how the idea of anthropologists like going and practicing certain things of a culture or of a religion to truly understand it, because it like puts the kind of it makes you use your body holistically as the tool for research. And I feel like that's kind of the only way to truly understand someone else's belief, by like doing that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. So mutually constructing each other, mutually informing each other, and getting into the methods. Cool. Do you have any questions you would like to ask any of these three teams we have before us?
I would ask that for you to raise your hand if you think that your true position would be somewhere in the middle. Okay, yeah. So I think we're in agreement. I think Megan Rose has done like a horrible thing making me choose.
I'm the religious authority here.
But I think that while I was listening to both of your rationales, what struck me was this, brought out about this quote from Mary Douglas, which is that what people, I don't know if it's actually from her, what people do, what people think they do, and what people say they do, are all very different things. And that got me thinking about what the question is actually asking, as in which would we rather choose for an anthropological study. What would the goal be? Is to create an accurate picture of how that religion exists on the ground, ethnographically. And perhaps thinking about the ways that the way people act is actually separate from what people say they believe, maybe practices slightly better. So there's your point of 1 year ago, actually. So yeah, I'm with the practice people. Sorry.
Good try, guys. Good try. Well done. Thank you. All right, you return to your seats. Thank you. I want to say that everything that was brought up here is absolutely valid and true. The idea of that Kiara was settling on here at the end is exactly what we're looking at when we take a practice approach. That is constructing a disposition to experience or believe or whatever you want to say in the world in a particular way. Yeah.
Would you say that, well, like you said, belief is like at the core, like religion and practice emerges out of that, right? So you have belief and then you go out of that and like practice, and that's how the core of it starts, right? But then, would you say that in order to observe both belief and practice, you would have to start first from, like kind of typically isolating things where you start with the practice, because as an anthropologist, you're an observer, you're participant observation, so you have to participate as well as observe. So you need to participate as well, and how you do that is through the practice. And after you do that, you kind of get a sense of what the belief is practice.
Yeah, great. So the question is, if
Sorry, my name is Mira.
has an R in it. Yeah. Thank you. So Mira's question is can we imagine belief as the kind of core of religion, but as anthropologists, what we have access to is practice. So studying practice allows us to understand kind of what people believe and how they believe. Yes, a lot of the time. I would say that there are some religions or religious experiences or spiritual that don't really have what we might strictly call beliefs. I'm thinking of a lot of the animist religions of Indonesia. People don't necessarily believe that a particular spirit is going to attack them if they do this. But they do kind of believe that there are spirits in the world, maybe, but they wouldn't necessarily articulate it like that. They would say, if you're out and alone in the world, in the forest, don't shout someone else's names because there are dwellers here. And you'd be like, what kinds of, But they wouldn't necessarily say, here we believe that the world is inhabited by dwellers or whatever. So the belief as the core of religion is something that may be true for a lot of the people that we work with. It certainly is fairly true for the nuns with whom I work. But we might want to be at least a little bit suspicious of saying all religion all the time has at its core a belief. Yeah? For those religions where there is a belief, yes, absolutely, practice can be a way into getting at what that experience is like and feels like. That's certainly the case with Tanya Lerman, right? Getting into the prayer practices leads her to this very specific understanding of what it's like to believe in this form of the Christian God, right? So yeah, thank you, Mira. Francis and then Sarah?
The learn thing as well is interesting, that they start with practice first,
Yes.
and you fake it till you make it sort
Yes.
of thing, that they do the practice, and then when they get good enough at the practice, then they start to believe because they start to experience God.
Yes.
They tend to believe and just do the practice until they actually do believe.
Yeah, absolutely. So Francis is pointing out that practice can be a way into belief even for believers, even for the religious people. Yeah, great. Sarah?
I was just thinking, because I came out of a class about statistics about religion.
Oh, nice.
So I was just thinking, if you look at, let's just take my home country as an example. So you have Sweden, where you assume that majority are very secular. But if you then were to just observe and do the immersive approach with the practice approach to researching, you find that a lot of people believe in atheism. An example would be that it's very common to just know instinctively that you cannot wash the floor with boiling water. But it's not because it says so on the care package for the linoleum. It's because the belief is that the little people that live under the floorboards will be very angry and they will retaliate.
Mm-hmm.
But no one's going to tell you it's because because then you're going to look crazy.
Yeah.
But it's just a given. You don't do that.
Right, so you're actually bringing up another question here, is that practices that have kind of become embedded over the centuries are still kind of tied to a belief in some sense, but at the same time they're not tied to a belief, because I imagine your friends and neighbors would say, it's not just that they wouldn't say, that they would say, oh, I do this so that the little people don't, right? They would say, I don't believe there are little people under my floor. They would say the opposite, right? And yet, if they did accidentally pour boiling water on us, this might make a feeling of fear, terror, anxiety, whatever. Yeah. I mean, same. We have a lot of little things like that come from the old religions, right? That persist in our bodies, that may no longer be tied to belief per se, but are also kind of tied to belief. At least our ancestors' beliefs. Yeah. Great. Other comments, questions? Cool, okay. All right, let's do a little more reading stuff. So I'm going to ask you, I'm getting a new strategy for reading, especially long ethnographies, especially for those of us who perhaps can't quite get into the ethnography. Will, I'm looking at you. For those, if you're feeling like this chapter or this book is about this thing, but I'm told to be looking at it in a particular way, this is a trick for reading, or it's a strategy, not a trick, it's not magic, it's a strategy for reading in the grain of anthropology. So today we're thinking about practice, right? We're thinking about approaching religion through practices. We've talked about habitus, disposition, field, techniques, strategy, the body, blah, 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 and how that can kind of make people certain kinds of subjects, right? So what I'm going to ask you to do is scan chapter 7, scan read again, and I want you to scan for words that seem related to practice. So literally the word practice and other things that might be related to disposition, technique, skill, and try to understand her argument using the sentences and the paragraphs where those key words, where those kind of conceptual words pop up. If you're feeling excited by this challenge, you may try to combine last week's strategy with this week's strategy. So you may want to just read the first paragraph of the first line of every paragraph and see if practice or a related term pops up there, and then really read that sentence. Yeah? Questions about that? Okay, I'm going to give you like 8 minutes to get as far as you can doing that, see what you can construct of her argument, with a focus on practice in this chapter that is ostensibly about psychology. Okay, and also just silence so everyone can read at their own pace. Okay. Come on back. Anyone like that strategy? Anyone hate that strategy? People still working on that? What's something that kind of popped out to you reading it that way? What did that do? Okay, when you read like that, it's a bit more active. How do you mean? Yes, what do you mean by that?
Like, I don't know, if I'm looking for something.
Yeah.
I'm not just like, it's not happening. That's right.
Yeah, good. So when you read like this, it's kind of triggering your brain a little bit to say, okay, I'm reading for something, for a particular theme, rather than kind of letting the words wash over me and my brain picks what it likes, right? Yeah, good. Did anyone pick up anything about practice specifically by doing it, focusing on that concept very quickly in these 8 minutes? It can be a very casual observation because this wasn't a long session. I think there's 2 kinds of practice that she's talking about in this chapter. Who can name one? Yeah, yeah.
It's one of the, I don't actually have the book with me, but I'm trying to remember. It might be wrong. It's like something like capital paper or something.
Oh, okay. Yeah. Catophatic and apophatic, yes. Yeah, good. So I, in my head, was categorizing that as one. So one is the prayer practices, but within that prayer practice, it's actually 2 prayer practices. One is a practice of imagining the full experience of a Bible story, for example. And the other one is reducing your kind of experience to sort of focus on a central thing. Yeah, good. Good. So yes, one kind of practice that she discusses in this chapter has to do with the prayer practice of the evangelical Christians. What's another kind of practice, though, that she talks a lot about in this chapter? It might not have to do with religion so much, at least on the surface.
Magic.
Magic? Okay, go on.
Well, she describes how she did her dissertation on how people practice magic in a modern day. So things like about witches, apparently there was like techniques which she practiced herself, which would include like imagination and like mental imagery.
Great, okay, I'm actually going to put that in a third category that I was talking about. But yes, she talks about the technique of magic and the practice of magic also having to do with creating kind of mental imagery in one's brain to create oneself as a witch or as a magic practitioner. Yes. Yeah, great. What's the third type of practice she discusses in this chapter? Third type of technique or skill. Takes up like a huge chunk of the first half of the chapter. Yeah?
Absorption.
Absorption, good, okay. Go on.
I found it, because it kept kind of giving different definitions, but it's like the mind's capacity to focus on the senses.
Good, okay. How do people get that? Because absorption is kind of the mind's openness to things, basically. Yeah. Go on.
Maybe through imagination.
Through possibly prayer practices or other kinds of imagistic practices,
Yeah.
which is stuff. Yes, good. So absorption here is kind of an effect of the other practices she's suggesting. So it's not, absorption is not a practice in and of itself. It's the kind of it's a facet possibly of a person or a quality of a person that allows for a particular kind of experience that is shaped by other practices that we're actually doing. Yeah. But we're on the right track here now, because whose term is absorption? What field does that properly belong to? We're using Bourdieu's terms. Yeah, Isaac? Psychology, great. So what's the other practice she talks a lot about in this chapter?
I mean, other disciplines in psychology.
Yes, exactly. So practices of psychology, and specifically psychological experimentation, right? So takes a lot of time to describe exactly what she's doing here and to kind of situate how what she's doing in this experiment is, one, different from regular anthropology practices, and two, related to this bigger field of psychological capital and power and all of this, right? So we can read this chapter as kind of talking about different kinds of practices of inskillment, we might say, learning different kinds of skills that create a certain kind of mental state, right? And this can happen through magic, it can happen through prayer, it can happen, but we can also think about the techniques of research also as a kind of practice that formed certain kinds of mental states as well, and certain kinds of knowledge. Excellent. So my point here is that when you're kind of doing this kind of strategy here for reading a chapter, scanning for a particular term, you might be able to extract something from the argument, from the chapter, that didn't strike you at first glance. And this might be useful when you're doing your voice thread, your midterm assessments in a few weeks, if you want to focus on a theme like practice, or a theme like belief, or a theme like mediation, right? You might take Lerman's book and see, okay, where in this book does she explicitly talk about this concept, and how does that relate to her argument, and what is she saying about it? Related to this strategy is looking at the index and seeing what pages she says it on, which I hope you guys already know how to do. But scanning for kind of related terms won't pop up in the index, so it's a good skill to work on. Okay, questions or comments for today? Things you want to talk about? Burning questions, issues? Okay, if something pops up, come see me in my office hours, or talk to Tom about what are your office hours?
Friday, 2 to 3.
Tom has office hours Friday 2 to 3, so go see him too.